attending, and I do now welcome representatives from the Brisbane Flight Path Community Alliance. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses giving evidence to Senate committees has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full names and the capacity in which you appear today?
Professor Marcus Ford. I'm the chairperson and spokesperson for the Brisbane Flight Path Community Alliance.
Thank you, Professor. Okay, we might just ask, can we control the... Presumably we can. We'll just maybe, if you speak up, or we might bring the microphones closer to you, possibly. Yeah. Try again. Just try again. But the main thing is there for the record. For your
My name is Professor Marcus Ford. I'm the chairperson and spokesperson for...
I think, yeah, we'll try and speak up, but I think we just have some limitations. I'm sorry, with the technology here. We'll do our best. Dr. Foley?
My name is Dr. Sean Foley. I'm a committee member on the Brisbane Flight Paths Community Alliance.
My name is Tess Bignall. I reside at Sanford. I'm the treasurer of the BFPCA and also community representative of AAB.
Thank you very much. Also, if people are struggling to hear or can't see, it is being broadcast live, so you can. The other option is you could go and use your phone or other technology to do that if you want to hear it. It'll also be available online afterwards. So I'm sorry, I probably can't do much more, but to speak up, and we've got the volume apparently as high as it can go. I apologise for that. Thank you very much for your submission. It's very comprehensive and been very useful to us. You also have the opportunity to make an opening statement if you'd like. Could you keep that short, maybe around 2 minutes or so we've got plenty of time for questions. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you, Senator. Aircraft noise pollution is not just a nuisance or inconvenience, it is a health issue and is causing real harm to families and communities in more than 220 suburbs across Greater Brisbane. With the launch of the new parallel runway on the 12th of July 2020 came a new airspace design and flight paths that concentrate aircraft noise over densely populated residential areas. Brisbane Airport and Air Services Australia sold this project to us, suggesting it will enable them to prioritise over-water operations that direct planes away from residential areas. Prior to the launch, BAC CEO Gert-Jan de Graaf is on the record saying the net effect of aircraft flying over the city will decrease. His statement turned out to be false and misleading. Today, we read in their submission to this inquiry, BAC has limited influence in reducing aircraft noise. That is why BFPCA wants the Australian government to enforce BAC to maintain their social licence to operate by legislating a curfew, a flight cap and a long-term operating plan. BAC's submission suggests the introduction of a curfew would stifle regional economic growth, reduce access to medical care, introduce inconvenient domestic flight times and increase cost of airfares. None of this occurred in Sydney or any other airport internationally that introduced a curfew. So why would this happen here? BAC further claims a curfew would cause an economic loss of over $2 billion annually in 2032. 2019 figures, though, show that Sydney Airport facilitated $7.6 billion of direct economic value to Australia, and this was with a curfew and a flight cap. If Sydney Airport can do this with a curfew, why can't Brisbane? The estimates BAC presents to us cannot be trusted. They are produced by a PR company called Queensland Economic Advocacy Solutions. The emphasis here is on advocacy, as they present a biased view which does not account for the property devaluations and for the health costs associated with Brisbane Airport's operations. Today we will hear from real experts, Dr. Sean Foley, Professor John Quiggin and distinguished Professor Lydia Murawska, who will offer a scientifically rigorous cost-benefit analysis, and I commend their findings to this committee. BFPCA's hope is that this inquiry will shine a light on the state capture of Australia's regulatory framework by the aviation industry, including unethical practices and misconduct by Air Services Australia. Air Services have repeatedly breached public trust. They have abused their powers to remove overwater operations without consultation or reapproval, and they have failed to meet ministerial conditions imposed upon them under the EBPC Act. In the definition of Australia's National Anti-Corruption Commission, this constitutes corrupt conduct. BFPCA's hope is that this inquiry will end the state capture and prepare for the introduction of strong regulation in the aviation sector to protect ordinary Australians. And I thank the committee and our supporters for enabling this inquiry. Thank you.
Thank you. I might just ask a threshold question and then throw to Senator Mackenzie. You made some very strong allegations in your submission, and you've repeated them there about the conflicts, and I think you've used the word corrupt. Can I clarify, though, is the evidence that members of Air Services Australia are receiving a personal benefit associated with the regulation of airport noise, aircraft noise, or is it just that they receive extra funding to fund their organisation, etc., in a way that's conflicted and potentially colours their advice?
We speak here as representatives of the community. We are not lawyers that can ascertain whether the allegations of corrupt conduct are correct. That's why we have a National Anti-Corruption Commission.
Right.
We read the information on the Anti-Corruption Commission's website. Our layman's reading is that they meet the definition of corrupt conduct.
I'm not asking a legal question, though, and I too don't exactly know, not a lawyer myself, but I'm asking about, is the allegation they are receiving a personal benefit? Are they getting extra money or kickbacks or some such, or is it just that the advice they're giving is coloured by the industry funding they receive?
We definitely have sufficient evidence to ascertain that Air Services have a conflict of interest because they've been corporatised. They operate as a company in service of the aviation industry. And that's actually something that they have publicly admitted in previous Senate estimates hearings. So what we believe is that there is a unmanaged conflict of interest between Section 9 of the Air Services Act 1995 that stipulates that their main priorities should be safety in the air and protection of communities on the ground. And they are prioritising profits.
And thank you. And just while you've just mentioned that, your submission mentions the Act requires the prioritisation of noise mitigation, noise minimisation. I think you just mentioned safety. I was going to ask that later, but I might as well do it now. We've had some submissions from pilots associations who are concerned that some of the measures to reduce noise can actually make flying more unsafe. I presume you would accept both of those issues must be managed carefully.
We don't question the need to maintain and prioritise safety, but at the same time, we would put to the Australian Pilots Association that introducing a flight cap or curfew has no safety implications whatsoever. That's why Sydney Airport has been successfully operating with a curfew and a flight cap since the mid-90s.
Yeah, in fairness, I don't think they were mentioning the curfew. It was some of the paths and wind
Correct.
conditions, etc. But yes. Thank you. Senator Mackenzie.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for attending. Great to see you again. My question essentially goes to Air Services Australia. You mentioned in your submission and in your opening remarks, the Ombudsman in 2021 reported, and I quote, Air Services Australia did not accurately model new flight paths for Brisbane Airport or their noise impacts before a parallel runway opened in July 2022. Given that that's the Ombudsman's reported findings, your commentary around Air Services Australia, I think, continues a long, well-worn path that we've all been on for a long time. It's a bit like cutting corners on your own homework, isn't it? If they're both in charge of doing the consultation and then in charge of other aspects of that. Could you just unpack that for the committee? Because as I understand it, the CEO, Jason Harfield's reappointment is in front of Minister King right now, and I would really like your community's response to now. I know she has refused to meet, but this is your opportunity.
Thank you, Senator, for this opportunity to address this question. I'd first refer the committee to our submission and specifically the chronology. Air Services submitted a referral under the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act for the airspace in Brisbane in 2007. Malcolm Turnbull, at the time of being Environment Minister, attached ministerial conditions to that approval. One of the conditions stipulated that Air Services was required to verify the, at the time, draft forecasts noise modelling in 2007 closer to the launch of the runway. What we found through freedom of information requests and documents that are available to the committee via our submission is that Air Services did, as you say, cut corners and mark their own homework. Not only did they mark their own homework, they actually asked their partner, Brisbane Airport Corporation, to do the assessment for them. So the actual scrutiny was outsourced to the project proponent. The Aircraft Noise Ombudsman in his report in 2021 specifically mentions a noise comparison report that was fabricated by the airport. The Aircraft Noise Ombudsman, whilst it's beyond the charter of conducting thorough investigations into federal administrative processes, did include a mention that suggests that this noise comparison report that the airport produced was very biased. It was obviously painting a picture of the project in their favour. Air Services then proceeded and took that report, put it on their letterhead, sent it to the Environment Minister, and everything was approved without further consultation or scrutiny.
So is it your contention then that Air Services Australia deliberately misled the community regarding the noise impacts and the approving minister at the time?
Yes, it is.
That's a pretty big claim.
It is.
Amen.
Can I just quickly say,
Yeah,
the
sure.
reason why we believe that we do have this evidence is the fact that it would be technically impossible to orchestrate thousands and thousands of people across Greater Brisbane in over 220 suburbs to come out with the same message. Like, no advertisement company is able to do that, but here we are. And we have now close to 30,000 complaints, more than all airports in Australia combined, that are all saying that they've been duped, they've been misled, that they had messaging about this project would be great for Brisbane, it would reduce the noise for those that were experiencing noise previously, and it would not be of concern to those that didn't have noise. Fast forward to today, and we have Air Services install a suicide hotline in order to deal with the mental health fallout
of this decision.
Of this decision, correct.
Absolutely. So who was the CEO of Air Services Australia at the time?
I would have to check this on notice, but I believe Jason Harfield has been in that role for the time that the reassessment was due in 2018.
Do you have a view about the reappointment of Jason Harfield, given the behaviour of Air Services Australia?
We believe the fish rots from the head, and we believe that the executive management of Air Services is responsible for mismanaging their obligations under the legislation.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Sod Props in a minute. I've got a whole list of questions, and there'll be a lot on notice because I know other senators have questions. Your organisation has been exceptional in the amount of advocacy that you've done with me in getting, when I first came into this role, but also on the change of government. Have you approached Minister King?
We did.
And how many meetings have you had with her or her office? Obviously, ministers can be busy.
Zero.
Zero.
So you had no meetings with her office?
You've requested meetings?
Yes.
And you're prepared to meet with an advisor, her chief of staff?
We were denied all opportunities to meet with staff or with the minister.
And why was that?
She asked her chief of staff to send us quite a boilerplate response because certain passages in that letter were taken from other responses that other members of the community had received. It was just talking about the Australian government that is currently working on an Australian aviation white paper, and we should sit down and send our submission to the white paper. There was no opportunity to meet with staffers or the minister, even when she was in Brisbane.
Right.
Did you offer,
would you
offer to go to Canberra?
I was in Canberra.
Yeah,
Oh, right.
he was in Canberra, just at last sitting. Does that offer to the minister or her office, or anyone indeed in the Albanese government, to actually meet with your community groups or representatives still stand? You'd be prepared?
It does.
All right, well, let's hope the minister takes up that opportunity. Just turning to Sod props. The data that's been provided to members of the committee shows that in 2023, approximately half of all flights occurred over Moreton Bay. Given weather and the propensity for wind to form over water, that's a fairly good achievement, wouldn't you agree?
No, what we are talking here is in over-the-water operations where the two runways are used for departure and arrival over water. So the figures that Brisbane Airport Corporation present is actually just normal operations. So you have either the wind that is northerly or the wind is southerly, which means that you have flights either arriving over residential areas or departing over residential areas. That is entirely different to how this project was sold to the community. The community was told the ability to have two runways gives them the option to fly entirely over water. Now, without technical background, someone who is an ordinary lay person would listen to that and say, that sounds like a good deal. And that's why there wasn't any opposition in the lead up to the launch. Precisely when you have the CEO of the airport on national television, even in February of 2020, still peddling that same line.
And the regulators, was CASA at all involved in this, given safety is an issue? It was only Air Services Australia's advice that the Minister relied on.
What we've been able to find out, again through Freedom of Information requests and documents we've obtained, is that Air Services was required to submit air change proposals, ACPs, to CASA. We asked CASA how they were scrutinised, and we also had senators and estimates ask CASA about that particular level of scrutiny. Their response was that they trust Air Services to do the right thing. They did not do any of their own engagement at the time, so they pretty much admitted to rubber stamping the ACPs for their mates in Air Services and the airport.
Bit of back scratching going on, would you agree?
We agree.
How has this decision affected property prices in the suburbs and areas impacted?
There is two studies I'd like to refer the committee to. One is by the Australian government itself. The Western Sydney Airport's environmental impact statement required a property analysis that was commissioned and conducted by JLL, a big property consultancy. For Brisbane, they looked at all the different airports at the time because obviously Western Sydney wasn't built in 2016. For Brisbane, they found a property devaluation of 10.67% with one runway. So this was before we actually had this very stark increase in the frequency and volume of flights. We are currently conducting our own property economic study that uses hedonic modelling in order to verify some of these figures. And there's also a submission that I refer you to by Professor John Quiggin, who is an ARC Laureate Fellow at the University of Queensland. And his submission to this inquiry is also including figures that verify the property devaluations across Brisbane.
How many people are involved in your community group? We've got a packed out room here today. People have bothered to spend the morning here, absolutely making their physical presence felt. But in terms of the number of Brisbanians who actually care about this issue, who don't want to see an airport shut down, but also want these types of issues resolved.
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to refer this question to my colleague, Dr. Sean Foley. He's conducted a study to ascertain residents that are affected and those that are moderately as well as severely affected. Would you like to comment?
Thank you, Senator. The number of people that live under flight paths, one flight path in Brisbane, is of about 700,000 people. The number that live under two flight paths, in other words, a departure flight path or an arrival flight path, which is where we happen to live, is of the order of about 400 to 500,000 people. That represents about 1/3 of the total population of Brisbane. Our group, BFPCA, has about 4,000 active members. But you can't talk to people in any of these suburbs without getting into a conversation about aircraft noise. It will be difficult to find someone who thinks it's a good idea.
Thank you, Dr. Foley. I've just got one more
fine.
question. Thank you. Does Air Services Australia have a conflict in being the agency that determines the flight path, appoints the aircraft noise ombudsman, and being a fee-for-service operator? The trifecta, one would
Yes,
say.
it is.
But I guess me stating it, I'm asking you, does that represent a conflict?
It does. What we hope this Senate inquiry will recommend is a complete overhaul of the regulatory framework that the aviation industry is embedded in. I think noise is obviously our main concern as a community advocacy group, but we've been looking at staff shortages that are fabricated by air services. We've been looking at sexual harassment and bullying scandals within air services. We've had a whole bunch of mismanagement when it comes to airlines, slot management in Sydney, and the list goes on. So I think the aviation industry in Australia is in a complete schlamazel.
Do you have a sense the government in its aviation white paper is going to go to that level of regulatory reform?
We are looking at the aviation white paper from 2009 under the Rudd-Gillard government, and we're looking at some of the recommendations that were proposed for Brisbane, for instance, and one of them includes to have a regular check whether Brisbane needs a curfew. That check has never occurred, so we don't believe that we can trust a aviation white paper to do the hard work of actually introducing regulatory reform work precisely because it's just called a white paper. That is just lingo adopted from the industry to have a bit of a discussion and fiddle around the edges without actually getting the job done.
Okay, and so in your opinion, would CASA be a more appropriate oversight body to regulate noise, given its role in balancing safety, practicality, training, maintenance, all the different things that actually play into aircraft noise, or at the least be responsible for appointing the Ombudsman and general oversight? Is there a greater regulatory role for CASA in this space, given Air Services Australia has all three?
We believe
levers?
That an entity that is still a statutory entity and has regulatory powers would be much better suited. The problem with giving CASA these kinds of authorities is that historically they have now adopted a culture of only looking at safety.
Yeah.
So when we've been trying to approach them, they were not interested in engaging with the public on these matters. They refer us back to the airport and they refer us back to Air Services. So even if from one day to another CASA was given those extra powers, we doubt that the staff would be equipped to be able to do this work.
So, and for those following along at home, CASA does have a responsibility legislatively to look at more than safety. It's just a cultural focus. Is that your...
We again asked in, we heard CASA answer in Senate estimates whether there's been any incidents where they actually picked up on anything not safety related in airspace change proposals, and they've never done that. So whilst we are now at a time where there is a overseas aviation airspace consultancy that has been engaged by former Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce for over $500,000, Tracks International, that found over 49 flaws in Air Services airspace design that they had 13 years to work on. CASA did not pick up any of those 49 issues. So we think that something's got to give with regards to who's marking whose homework.
Thank you very much for your evidence.
I'll go to Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Chair. Well, good morning to your wonderful group and good morning to everyone who's joining us today. I'm a fellow Brisbane resident, so I know what we're all going through, and I think we can all see from the presence in the room of you all how strongly the community feels about this issue. So can I ask Professor Foth, or perhaps Dr. Foley, can you please run us through what are the impacts on our community of this ridiculous aircraft noise?
Thank you, Senator. I've been digging into the whole issue of what aircraft noise does to people. Aircraft noise is only one part of the equation, as it were. And I think that Professor Lydia Moroska is going to talk about the health issues to do with particulates from aircraft. the range of diseases that are caused by chronic exposure to aircraft noise keeps getting longer. It's definitively associated with cardiovascular diseases, with epilepsy, with diabetes, with hypertension, high blood pressure, and a range of psychological issues from annoyance to anger to depression and so on. None of this work, unfortunately, has been done in Australia. This is all work that has been done over the years, largely in Europe and America. But there is no doubting the validity of this work. And my considered opinion is that the noise and the other pollutants, the particulates and the gases, do represent a significant public health problem for Australia. And of course, the closer you are to the airport, the more of a problem it is. So we have a public health issue hiding in plain sight. If Australia depends so greatly on aviation for transport, which it does, it's very important that we pay attention to the downside of this and start doing our own research into what's happening. I think one of the things that could be done, for instance, is that the airport or the appropriate authority is required to run health checks, monitor the health impacts on the communities that are overflown by aircraft. This is done in Europe, it's done in America. I don't see why it can't be done here. There's plenty of expertise. The other point that I would make at this time is that we depend on one metric, one measure of aircraft noise. It turns out that the A-weighted scale for aircraft noise, which is the scale that's weighted to what we hear as humans, and it's effective for that, misses out on a very important part of the noise spectrum, which is noise below 500 hertz. And it's this low frequency noise and the infrasound, which is below 20 hertz, that has been pretty definitively associated with causing the diseases that I just mentioned. So we have a really serious problem here that the metric we are using is not giving us the information we need. So there needs to be deeper work done. I'm just one person in a small group working on this here. We need university quality investigations into the health impacts of aviation in Australia. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. It sounds to me like the profits of Brisbane Airport Corporation and the airlines are being put ahead of the community's health. When did that become okay? And what can be done to reverse that?
Well, our suggestion has been put forward before. A first step, which is basically cost-free, Professor Quiggin will talk about the economics of that, is a cap on flight movements and a curfew. And so that these are not just one-off, a long-term operating plan. There's lots of other work to be done, but these are straightforward, they have no safety implications, and they would make a big difference.
I suspect the airline folk will tell us that their profits will suffer if we do those things that will help the quality of life for people who live in this beautiful part of the world. What's your contention to that assertion that somehow their profits will suffer and it's just not worth it for them to care about their community?
Their profits result in what economics calls externalities. And as Professor Quiggin will show, the externalities are greater than the profits. Sydney Airport, which has now had a curfew and a movements cap for over 20 years, is still a viable operating business. It hasn't suffered a profit loss and it hasn't gone bankrupt. There is no reason to believe that Brisbane Airport would suffer those kinds of problems either. We haven't seen an independent economic analysis of what these would be. I think I've read Professor Quiggin's analysis. It's impressive. With my own training, I understand what he's saying. He believes that the economic consequences are minor, but the the health and well-being consequences, the positive consequences for Brisbane residents are major.
If I can quickly add, the big distinction here is that the figures presented by the airport are not a proper cost-benefit analysis. They are only presenting benefits of a certain type. And what we really need to phase up to is the fact that these profits are based on socialising the losses. They are privatising profits on the basis of property devaluations, of loss of amenity, of health harms that we pay for. So what this actually results in is a capital transfer from ordinary Australians to a corporation that has a 30% share in the Queensland Investment Corporation, the Queensland State Government, as well as overseas stakes with industry super funds and the Dutch government through the Schiphol Group. So we believe that we were never consented to hand over wealth to this corporation and are suffering as a consequence of their operations without any compensation right now.
Well, for the record, I agree completely with your assertion. I don't understand why, if Sydney can have a curfew and flight caps and still be perfectly able to continue operating and servicing people's needs, I don't understand why Brisbane can't also have that. What's your view of why there's such a resistance to curfews and flight caps per hour?
The projections that Brisbane Airport based their investment decision on to build a second runway are based on overinflated passenger figures. And again, Professor John Quiggin in his submission alludes to some of the issues with passenger numbers not being where they are supposed to be according to BAC's views. This is passenger numbers though. So we believe as a fallback position, the airport has now changed their commercial strategy to turn Brisbane into the Detroit of Australia. So we have now an airport that has heavily invested in freight and cargo infrastructure. We are seeing announcements about attracting DHL, Australia Post, the Amazon warehouse, and the list goes on of freight forwarding companies that largely operate at night time. This is to make up the deficit in passenger numbers by looking at cargo business and freight business. Now, on that basis, they are trying to catch up to the original investment projections, but again, that wasn't part of the original consultation, and again, it requires a regulatory response in order to protect the host community, because we are now dealing with an airport with a city attached to it rather than a city with an airport attached to it.
Ms. Bignell, just some questions for you. I thought your observations about your involvement in the group that you've been appointed to represent the community on were really very disappointing, and I share your frustration. Can you give us a potted version of your experience of the so-called community consultation that you've been engaged in and the outcomes it's produced?
Just a brief note for an opening sort of address. Minister King continues to neglect her responsibility as an elected politician by the people on this matter. Minister King has demonstrated that the AAB is the only mechanism that the Brisbane community have to bring their concerns. AAB's role, as per their terms of reference, is to implement the Noise Action Plan for Brisbane. Community representatives feel we are part there just to mark theatre engagement and to mark Air Services and BAC's homework. The Chair's role of independence is questionable to community reps. I was expecting more support from the AAB to bring about positive actions for the community. I was not expecting to be requested to suppress information from my community. I was not expecting to feel like there was a bias, mainly the interactions with the chair and industry, in favour of industry. My submissions includes various examples. AAB has resulted in 0 outcomes for the community thus far. It's met basically 4 times in person, once online. To give you an example, we would have expected that the chair would investigate further the authenticity of the business case of Qantas and Jetstar to retrofit the A320 fuel vents, but we were given a letter from the chair that demonstrated this case. This case needed to be tested, and it wasn't. We also would have thought the chair would request the full-length runway departure trial to be done properly with a new SID and air service, because air services modelling has proven over the last nearly 4 years to be incorrect. The biggest impact on most communities is aviation noise. Noise impacts such as the health issues is a banned subject at AAB. BACAG is not the forum to be addressing such serious issues. Air Services Noise Action Plan for Brisbane has no noise metric for the reduction in noise. Does their action plan mean 1 decibel less or 10 decibels less? Does it mean we can sleep at night? So what is the end goal here? The airport is there for its efficiencies, and that equates to profits, which are ranked over our community. Industry has no consequences for not doing the right thing by community or incentives for doing the right thing by community. This is why the Senate Inquiry Committee must look at the London City Noise Action Plan. This is a great example of the use of parliamentary regulatory framework in order to safeguard and protect the community and for Brisbane as a whole and Australia. We need to strike a balance. We have thousands of families around Brisbane and Australia suffering at the hands of an unregulated industry. We are not their collateral damage. We are Australians and we matter.
Just with my last question, thank you for that. And I, on behalf of the government, even though I don't represent them, I would like to apologise to the community for what you've been put through and for the tokenistic consultation, the appearance of consultation whilst actually the big corporations are still, laughing all the way to the bank. So we will keep working to try to fix this. There's a number of us here that are interested in that, and we hope that the Minister actually takes a meeting with you and finally starts to listen. I'll just flag that my colleague Libby Watson-Brown, the Greens member for Ryan, has introduced a private member's bill that would put a curfew for Brisbane, that would put hourly flight caps, and that would also require a long-term plan with community consultation involved in its design. So I'll flag that we have been listening, and that's our attempt to try to fix this. But of course, it requires the government to engage. So this is my commitment to you that we will keep trying to push them on this issue. Thank you.
Just a clarification, Tess. Who appoints the chair of AAB?
The Minister.
Thank you.
Senator Colbeck.
Thanks. Ms Bignell, it would appear from what you've just said that you believe, or your experience is, that the whole process basically allows the... It is turned up fairly loud. That you believe, or your experience is, that the whole process allows the aviation sector to operate effectively unfettered.
Correct.
And without any deference to the issues that you're facing.
Correct.
I just want to go back to the discussion around the restrictions at Sydney Airport, and you make your points in relation to the profitability of the airport and issues of that matter. But I do have a concern that it's being presented as if there are no issues as a result of the restrictions at Sydney Airport. And there are some issues that come from that. The pilots have put to us, for example, that they have some concerns that it raises some safety issues with requirements for them to operate outside international safety parameters. And I just want to ask you how you see that being balanced. It goes back to the question that the Chair asked at the outset of your evidence today, and it is a really important matter, and I acknowledge that you have recognised it in what you've said. But how do we effectively get a system that appropriately balances those matters? Because that also is important. You've acknowledged that there's a requirement for the airport to be there. The issue that you're looking to see is a fair balance in the operation of that and consideration of your issues, as I see what you've said today. So how do we deal with those things which are actually critical in the proper operation of the system?
Thank you, Senator. The submission from the Australian Federation of Airline Pilots, I read it twice since it was uploaded, and I believe that they do offer a fair critique, but the critique is aimed at the kinds of mechanisms and instruments that the airport is now clutching onto. So, for instance, one major part of the submission deals with the tailwind reductions. That is seen as only a minor change if it was to come into effect in terms of producing a noticeable impact on Brisbane communities. And we can see why they're arguing that there is safety implications around increasing the tailwind limitation back to 10 knots. The submission is entirely comment-free when it comes to flight caps and curfews. There's nothing of concern of not using the city ends of the runways, for instance, and only using over water operations to avoid residential areas as it's done in Sydney. And Sydney has pretty much operated incident-free as a result of those measures that were introduced. But I think what we also need to acknowledge is the bigger picture of the state capture here by the industry, as you outlined in the beginning. We are not just dealing with a regulatory framework that is not fit for purpose. We are actually dealing with a situation where there is a revolving door of board appointments, of servants that go from the one side of the spectrum to the other side. We are looking at board appointments of Air Services Australia, and we see that the same person is also director of the Western Sydney Airport and has come from an airline, and it goes back to an airline. And so this entangled spaghetti mess of nepotism and corruption is something that we want to take further. The Senate inquiry is obviously a major achievement for this community, but we won't stop here. We will continue to put the blowtorch on the airport until all our demands are met and those that have done wrong have been put to justice.
Thank you, Senator Colbeck. We're a little bit over time, but I've just got a couple of questions myself. I wanted to ask about the full runway trial, takeoff runway.
Our favourite topic.
Okay, because you did provide some very useful, well, I thought useful information here. But can I just confirm what's happened here? There was a trial of this, is my understanding, from what you provided to us. And your contention, I think, but I get a bit lost with some of the jargon here, but your contention is that this trial actually didn't change the flight path that was used for takeoff and landings. Is
correct.
That correct? Am my conclusion correct?
Yes, Senator, that is correct. In a nutshell, what happened was that in the lead up to the 2022 federal election, the coalition government set up a BAPATH, which was another entity, I suppose, similar to AAB. It had different membership on it. That committee recommended that trials were supposed to be done in order to give the community a much more immediate relief. Those members were not aviation experts. However, in the last round of Senate estimates, we heard from Peter Curran, who blamed the members for not giving air services proper instructions to increase the height markers in order to conduct a proper trial. So they have disingenuously interpreted the task that they were given by this committee, and they have, in fact, prohibited intersection departures. But that is completely useless without increasing height markers because, as we would know, pilots would enter into their flight management system the length of the runway, the weight of the aircraft, where they have to head. So if we point into the sky in the same spot, we will always aim at that same spot and reach that same spot, whether they use the full length of the runway or half of the runway. And so that is the actual result why Air Services trial produced no noise reduction whatsoever. And so we heard from Ron Brent, the chair of AAB, that this was the same result in Perth. We believe that that is the reason why both the trials in Perth and in Brisbane need to be redone with proper independent experts that are actually increasing these height markers, because I mean, you don't have to be an expert to realize that if I fly the same altitude over people before and I fly the same altitude afterwards, there's no difference.
I mean, yeah, look, but and I'm just trying to get this, make sure I'm fully across that. So the contention is I suppose, theory of the trial is if you put the height marker higher and the plane reaches altitude quicker, that will reduce noise for some communities at least, but the corresponding cost is presumably it costs more, does it, to get the flight to get the plane? Does it use more fuel? I mean, what's the resistance to doing that, I suppose?
The resistance, first of all, yes, it does reduce noise, and it does reduce noise anywhere in the world except in Australia. So we don't believe that the laws of physics are any different in this country than they are elsewhere in the world. The reason for the resistance is really profit, because profit is the number one criterion that the aviation industry operates by. And so the real point there is the taxi time. Because it takes longer for a plane to taxi all the way to the very beginning of the runway, turn around, it does create efficiencies. But this is just one of the examples where profits, commercial considerations and efficiencies are trumping the protection of communities on the ground.
So it's not so much the use of fuel, it's the extra cost, it's the time to take it. That's the contention of the airlines?
It is probably a bit of both.
Right, okay.
But again, we have now experienced 4 years, some communities even longer, since Kevin Rudd marched in Oxford Street in Bulimba, leading up to him entering Parliament. And we have not seen any compromise, any sacrifice, any kind of bone being thrown to the community by the airport or air services whatsoever.
And I just wanted to clarify the evidence on SODROPs. I mean, the data you provided here is very limited use of SODROPs, but then Senator McKenzie mentioned the data saying that half the flights, I think half in 2023, used it. Can you just explain the difference here with what your evidence is showing, a very limited use of it in your submission, but seemingly quite at least half using it in total?
Yes, Senator. In the lead up to this proposal being launched, when it was communicated to Brisbane families and communities, the airport was aiming for about 90% of flights to operate over water and away from residential areas.
When was that? That was before the second runway?
This was before the launch. They said a second runway will enable them to put the airport into SOPROPS mode. If we had SOPROPS happening more often, we would see figures of 70, 80, 90% of using one runway over water for arrivals, the other one over water for departures. The fact that we are now seeing about 50-50, in fact, the more accurate figures look at or suggest the majority of flights over residential areas, that suggests normal runway operations anywhere in the world, because you have them arriving from one side, departing on the other side. And when the wind changes, it goes the other way. So that means you'll always have flights over residential areas.
Now that I've looked at your graph again, because the axis started at 40, I just misinterpreted that. It is 50% in your graph. So that's clear. I've just checked that, and basically from your graph though, it hasn't changed really with the second runway. It was running at 50% before the second runway.
Well, that is correct, but the claim was that it would enable them to go all the way to 90% over water operations, and now the majority is over people.
So why hasn't it changed?
Yeah, that's right. Like it just hasn't. Well, there was an uptick after the second runway, or just before, in fact, but stayed up for a little bit, up around 55%, but it's now back down to 50%, which is basically what it was before.
The salt props, which is the technical term for all the water operations, is a bit of a red herring. So whilst there were certain disclaimers attached to footnotes in the original 2007 environmental impact statement, it would really be something that ordinary lay people would not necessarily notice. So there is conditions around cloud cover, around whether the runway is wet or not, whether there is more than 20 aircraft in the sky. We now recently heard that it's not just whether 20 aircraft are arriving or departing. Even if a plane leaves Auckland in New Zealand and travels to Singapore and is somewhere in the upper airspace, that is all of a sudden included in this 20 maximum. So Air Services is looking for a whole bunch of reasons why the airport can't be put into SOP props mode, again, in order to appease their commercial partners, because they hate SOP props, because it does curtail the capacity of the runway configuration.
But just to clarify, the promise was, despite all those conditions and caveats in the footnotes and terms and conditions, the promise was that a second runway would allow more over-water flights to occur.
Correct.
And that has not happened.
Correct.
Yes. Senator Colbeck for the last couple of questions.
Just one question off the back of that. Given all of the prevailing weather conditions and things of that matter that go into the decision-making process as to how directionally a runway might operate, or the airport might operate, how realistic do you think that the original claims of 90-odd% or up to 90% of the airport operating out over the water were in the first place? It would appear to me that the realistic application of all of those things that go into the decision making as to the directional use of an airport, of the runway, would probably have resulted in what we're seeing operationally now, and the 90% was never realistic as a claim in the first place.
That is correct. The 90% was never realistic. We are now getting technical explanations why it wasn't realistic, but it goes even further. The scandal really goes all the way back to the 80s and 90s, when the airport took over the lease of that Commonwealth Crown land and opened the airport in its location in 1988. They based their profitability assessment on eventually building a second runway. The question was, in what direction is that runway going to point at? And we traced, again, through historic documents that we've retrieved, the analysis of why this parallel runway is the preferred solution. And there is a whole bunch of inaccuracies in that assessment, because during the master planning phases, they suggested that we will do our proper analysis during the EIS and MDP, Major Development Plan. But in the EIS MDP document, they said, oh, we've already decided previously in our master planning phase that this is the best operation. So in 2003 was the master plan that is particularly relevant for us. 2007 was the MDP EIS. And they both point and reference each other of having done the proper analysis, but in fact there is no proper analysis, and now we are looking at experts that are suggesting a cross runway would have given Brisbane communities a much better noise outcome, but the cross runway at Brisbane Airport is now a taxiway.
Thanks.
Just sorry, I didn't say that would be the last question, but our hard-working staff wants me to ask another very useful question, I think. Can I get your thoughts on continuous descent operations? Is that potentially a solution if I don't even know what that is. Maybe you can explain that. I'm sure the person who said it to me knows, but can you explain that, and if you know it, and is it useful?
I think it's useful to address this point because it again demonstrates that whilst Jason Harfield and Senate Estimates maintains that flight path design is their bread and butter, they are entirely incompetent and unable to do the work that the government really requires them to do. We do not have these continuous descent arrivals in Brisbane because they cut corners. We had an existing airspace architecture that was attached to the legacy pathway, and they just kept most of it intact, so that the arrivals that are leading to the new power runway needed to maintain a safety separation with that existing architecture. That means, and pilots refer to dirty flight paths, that means that they are actually stepping down like on an escalator and not using a continuous glide path. By having the stepped approach, they need to extend their flaps early in order to stay in the air. With extended flaps, there's more friction, there's more noise, the altitude is lower, which means they are closer to the ground. That is more noise times 2. And because the engines have to rev up in order to maintain that thrust, there is more noise times 3. So Air Services, in all their technical expertise, created a scenario that is not reducing noise, it's actually creating an amphitheatre.
May I just
Senator,
add a small amount to that? In working out how many suburbs are affected by aircraft noise and so on, I tracked using a piece of software called Flight Radar 24, which gives you the altitude of aircraft. I tracked hundreds of arrivals at the airport on the old and the new runway. The reality is that aircraft, almost without exception, maintain 3,000 to 4,000 feet right the way across Brisbane, from Forest Lake in the southwest until they do their final descent, starting at about the CBD. So we don't have a continuous descent. We have a level flight, basically, all the way across the city, with flaps extended, wheels down, the noisiest possible. The pilots call it a dirty configuration, and that's what we've got.
That's very interesting. I noticed that actually. Now you tell it. You notice when you're coming in, the thrust goes, and you think you're going to. You think. Oh no, can't land right now. And we've got a circle, but they keep going. So that's now explains it.
About 30 kilometres.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It was very, very useful to our committee. Sorry to keep you a little bit longer, but as I say, that was very, very informative for us. Have a great day. I think there was maybe one partial question taken on notice, but I think that was more to check. And when are we asking for those back by, Taz?
If I submit some more, though?
6th of May. We're asking for any questions back 6th of May to help our inquiry, and Senator Mackenzie might send you some further questions at your discretion if you're able to respond to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.